If you love quiet tension, powerful dukes, and women who refuse to bend, then you are exactly where you belong. Before we begin, tell me this. If you were in her place, would you protect your pride? Or risk everything for a man like him? And while you're here, tell me where in the world you're listening from. I read every comment. Now, let the story begin. The candles in Aldwick Hall had been burning since 7 o'clock. By the time Miss Clara Voss passed through the servants' entrance, the correct entrance, the only entrance available to a paid companion on an evening like this, every chandelier in the main hall was blazing. Every mirror doubled the light. The grand staircase was dressed in white roses, cut that morning from the estate garden, already beginning to close in the heat of 100 candles. Clara did not look at the roses. She walked 2 paces behind Lady Agnes Whitmore and kept her attention on the floor ahead. Smooth marble, no uneven edges, nothing to cause an elderly woman to stumble. That was her task this evening. That was the whole of it. She wore a dress of pale gray muslin, clean, pressed, narrow ivory trim at the collar, which she had repaired herself 3 weeks ago with thread that did not quite match. It was the best she owned. She had long since stopped making apologies for it, to others or to herself. Lady Agnes paused at the entrance to the ballroom and drew herself up. She was 73 years old, partially deaf in her left ear, and entirely formidable. She had attended this assembly for 41 consecutive years. She had outlasted 3 of her own husbands and, as she frequently observed, the reputations of most people currently in the room. "They have moved the palms," she said. "Yes, my lady. They were better where they were." "Yes, my lady." Lady Agnes moved forward. Clara followed. The ballroom stretched before them. Long, high-ceilinged, lit to the point of extravagance. The Harwick Midsummer Assembly Ball was the most anticipated event in the county. It fell this year to Aldwick Hall, which meant it was grander than usual. Better flowers. Better musicians. A better class of cruelty. Because the Duke was home. That was the particular electricity running through the room. Clara felt it the moment they crossed the threshold. That specific collective awareness, that group of people who had individually decided to appear casual and were collectively failing. 3 months ago, word had come through the county like a slow fire. James Aldwick, the 7th Duke of Carrowmere, had returned to Yorkshire. 5 years absent. Back now, for reasons the county debated with the intensity usually reserved for parliamentary elections. He was 34. He was unmarried. His estates required an heir. Every family in this room with an eligible daughter had drawn their own conclusions. Clara guided Lady Agnes to a chair near the eastern wall, far enough from the dancing floor to avoid the crowd, angled toward the room so the old woman could see everything worth seeing. This was the position Lady Agnes had occupied for 41 years, and she settled into it with the authority of long possession. A cluster of women in silk and tulle stood nearby, not quite close enough to constitute intrusion, close enough to be heard. "He must settle this season," said the one in deep burgundy, Mrs. Drummond, Clara recalled. Her husband owned the eastern parcel of land that had once belonged to the Voss family. Before everything, his solicitor made inquiries at Christmas about the East Wing renovations. One doesn't renovate for a bachelor. "Cecily is confident," said the second. "Cecily is always confident," said a third, suppressing a smile. They laughed. Prettily, precisely, with the control of women who have learned that laughter is a social instrument. Clara adjusted the shawl at Lady Agnes's shoulders and said nothing. She had not come here expecting anything from the evening. She held no illusions about her own position. The name Voss had not commanded standing in this county for 3 years. Not since the scandal, not since the magistrate's ruling, not since her father was branded an embezzler before the county court while Clara sat in the gallery above and kept her face completely still. Thomas Voss had died 8 months later. Not violently. He had simply grown quieter and quieter, like a fire losing its fuel, and one February morning he had not woken up. Clara had sold the remaining furniture to pay his final debts. She had found a cottage. She had found work. She did not dwell. Dwelling was a luxury. She sat down in her chair beside Lady Agnes and turned her attention to the room. The orchestra was playing a gavotte. Couples arranged themselves on the polished floor. Clara watched the patterns, the social geometry of it, the way proximity communicated desire, the way every person in the room was performing some version of themselves that they hoped would be received. She performed nothing. She simply observed. And so she was perhaps the first person in the room to see the double doors at the far end open. He did not announce himself. No footman preceded him. No steward made declaration. The Duke of Carrowmere walked into his own ballroom the way a man enters a room he owns, without ceremony, without urgency, without any apparent interest in the effect his entrance produced. And yet the room knew. It knew the way weather knows, not announced, simply present. Conversations slowed. Glasses paused at lips. Heads turned, first in ones and twos, then in a continuous sweep, toward those double doors. James Aldwick was tall. That was the first thing. Height that distinguished him even in a room of well-made men. He wore black evening dress, a single gold chain at his waistcoat. No decoration beyond that. His dark hair was cut close and severe. His jaw was set. His eyes moved across the room from left to right in a slow, systematic sweep. He did not smile. He accepted a glass from a footman with a brief nod. He stood at the edge of the floor and he simply surveyed. Clara had expected something else. The county's daughters had spoken of him with a particular feverish precision. Mrs. Drummond had called him devastating. Miss Arabella Fenn had declared him the most elegant man in England. Clara had constructed from these descriptions a man who knew his own power and used it consciously, who smiled too much upon entering a room because he understood the room was watching. The Duke of Carrowmere did not smile. He stood with his glass and his survey, and the thing that was most unsettling about him, she identified it quickly because she was good at identifying things, was the quality of his stillness. It was not the stillness of a man who was bored. It was the stillness of a man who had decided, very deliberately, that only certain things warranted his movement. That was not a social grace. That was a discipline. Beside her, Lady Agnes stirred. "Is he here?" "He arrived just now, my lady." "Good." The old woman's eyes remained closed. "Fetch me the lemon syllabub before the young ones get to it. There is never enough syllabub at these events. There has never been enough syllabub at any event I have attended in 40 years. Clara rose and smoothed her skirt. She kept close to the wall. This was habit, 3 years of it, practiced until automatic. Walls did not whisper as you passed them. Most people at the center of a room did not notice anyone moving along its edges. She was nearly at the refreshment table when Miss Cecily Drummond stepped into her path. Not accidentally. Cecily Drummond was 20 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having never been refused anything she wanted by anyone with the power to refuse it. She stood with 2 companions behind her, all 3 wearing expressions of studied surprise, as though Clara were an unusual object someone had left on the floor. "Miss Voss." Cecily said it the way one says a word one has learned exists but has no real use for. "I didn't realize you had been invited." "Good evening, Miss Drummond," Clara said. "Are you here as Lady Agnes's?" One of the companions produced a small, delicate laugh and did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "I am," Clara said evenly. Cecily tilted her head with the artistry of a woman who has practiced theatrical sympathy in a mirror. How very industrious. Her gaze moved over the gray dress. "In your circumstances, I imagine any occupation must be a relief." The word circumstances was placed carefully. It was always the word. Not family, not situation, not position, circumstances. It implied that what had happened to Clara was a condition she inhabited rather than a thing that had been done to her. Clara held Cecily's gaze without blinking, without flushing, without performing any of the reactions she knew were being waited for. "It is," she said simply. "Will you excuse me?" Not a question. A sentence with the weight of a closed door. She stepped around Cecily and continued to the table. She did not hurry. That was the important part. She had learned it the hard way in the first year when she had hurried, and understood afterward that hurrying communicated exactly what people like Cecily wanted to see. Hurrying said, "You hurt me." Stillness said, You are not worth my pace." She collected the syllabub and walked back. Lady Agnes consumed her syllabub with great satisfaction, and fell into conversation with two elderly women who had materialized in the adjacent chairs. Clara sat and listened and watched the room. The dancing had progressed to a quadrille. And then, across the floor, she saw it begin. The Duke set his glass on a nearby table. He turned. He began to move through the room toward the cluster of prominent families near the far wall. Not directly, not with visible urgency, but with the inevitability of water finding its level. He stopped before Lady Philippa Hurst. Lady Philippa was the daughter of an earl. She was composed, clever, and had been positioned near the dancing floor for the past 40 minutes with the patient precision of a woman who has calculated every variable. When the Duke bowed, she received it perfectly. A curtsy, a smile, a hand extended at exactly the correct height. They took the floor together for the quadrille. The room held its breath. Clara watched the Duke's posture during the dance. Upright. Correct. He spoke when the figure required it and was silent when it did not. He did not lean toward Philippa. He did not search her face. He was neither cold nor warm. He was simply executing the dance with complete technical accuracy, the way a man plays a piece of music he has long since mastered and no longer finds interesting. Philippa, for her part, was radiant. She laughed at precisely the right moments. She held her chin higher than usual. The quadrille ended. The Duke returned her to her father with a correct bow. He stood apart for 3 minutes. Then he crossed to Miss Cecily Drummond. Cecily accepted with a brilliance that was nearly blinding. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, as though in private prayer. Clara watched his face during the reel. It had not changed. Not one fraction. He looked at Cecily Drummond with precisely the same attention he had given Philippa Hurst. Measured, present, entirely non-committal. When Cecily said something amusing, his expression shifted by the narrowest possible margin. Not a smile. An acknowledgement. The reel concluded. He returned her to her family. Then Miss Arabella Fenn, a minuet. Then Miss Frances Ashby, a country dance. Then Miss Louisa Pemberton, a waltz. The county watched each dance with the intensity of scholars interpreting scripture. Every return, every pause, every direction of his gaze between figures. All of it was reviewed, weighed, and quietly debated. Was Philippa first because she was preferred, or because she was standing nearest? Had he smiled for Cecily, or had Mrs. Drummond imagined it? Would he ask one of them again? Clara sat against the wall and watched the whole of it with the attention she brought to everything in this county. Not detached, but clear-eyed. She had no stake in this particular game. She was not a piece on the board. She was in the room the way a lampstand is in a room. Present, functional, unremarked upon. She had made a kind of peace with this. Most days. Lady Agnes fell asleep at 9:30. Clara adjusted the shawl, verified the old woman would not slide from her chair, and returned her attention to the floor. A sixth woman. A seventh. The orchestra played on. There is a particular kind of loneliness to being invisible in a crowded room. Clara understood it the way you understand a country you have lived in long enough, not fondly but fluently. She knew its textures. She knew the specific quality of a conversation that pauses when you approach and resumes when you move away. She knew the weight of eyes that look past you rather than at you. She knew the sound of her own name said in the specific tone that means the speaker considers themselves generous for saying it at all. She had not always known these things. When she was younger, when her father came home with books tucked under his arm and talked about the law at supper with real fire, she had moved through rooms like this without thinking. She had never been the most admired girl in any gathering. She had never possessed Cecily Drummond's particular coloring or Philippa Hurst's title. But she had existed, fully, as a person whom other people saw. The magistrate's ruling had ended that. She did not blame the people in this room. She understood the mechanism. Social standing is a collective agreement. When enough people withdraw their agreement simultaneously, the thing simply ceases to exist. The way a currency collapses when belief in it collapses, not because the paper has changed, but because confidence has. What she did blame, privately, precisely with the cold patience of 3 years, was the lie at the center of it. Her father had not embezzled. She was as certain of this as she was of anything in her life. Thomas Voss had been meticulous, principled to the point of professional inconvenience, and in the last year of his practice he had been working through something in the county land registry. Something that had made him quiet and careful in a way she had recognized as the particular quietness of a man who has found something important and is being very careful about what he does with it. He had come home one evening in November and said, "Clara, whatever happens, I have done nothing dishonest. Not once. Not ever." She had not known what he meant. She understood now. She had spent 3 years understanding it, piece by piece, in the long evenings of the cottage with nothing but time and her father's papers and the intelligence that was, perhaps, the only thing Thomas Voss had managed to give her intact. Understanding something and proving it were different problems. She folded her hands in her lap. The orchestra began a slow waltz. Couples arranged themselves. The floor filled. Clara watched the Duke between dances, standing apart from the room, not performing ease, simply occupying his own stillness. He had completed his social obligation. He had danced with every significant family. He was now free as the host to do whatever he chose with the remainder of the evening. She watched him survey the room again. Slow, systematic, left to right. She looked away. She was watching Lady Agnes, checking the angle of the old woman's chin, the steadiness of her breathing, when the air beside her changed. She looked up. James Aldwick, the Duke of Carrowmere, stood 3 feet away. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the room, with that same measuring attention he had been applying to everything all evening. His glass was in his left hand. His expression was exactly as it had been since he walked through the double doors. Set, contained, giving nothing away. Then he turned. Their eyes met. His were dark gray, the color of a winter sky when the light has almost but not entirely gone. And they were. She noted this with the precision of a woman who notes everything. Completely, unreadably still. He said nothing. He glanced at the empty chair to her left. He looked at her briefly as though checking something. Then he sat down. It moved through the ballroom the way a cold current moves through warm water. Not an announcement. Not a sound. Simply a change in the quality of the air. Something present where something else had been, spreading outward from the eastern wall in a wave that touched every cluster of conversation in the room without being invited. A woman near the punch bowl stopped mid-sentence. Not because she had been told to. Because some part of her attention, operating below conscious intention, had received information and refused to be ignored. Cecily Drummond turned her head from a cousin's remark and the remark went unanswered. Lady Philippa Hurst, standing with her father and 2 men of the county's upper tier, followed the direction of several carefully averted glances and found the source. Something moved across her face, swift, controlled, visible only because Clara happened to be watching for it. A fracture. Small. Sharp. There and gone. Mrs. Drummond turned to her husband with an expression that communicated, without language, that several things she had assumed were now in question. The Duke of Carrowmere sat against the eastern wall, beside a woman in a gray dress. He had not asked her to dance. He had sent no intermediary. He had not approached gradually, in the socially legible manner of a man building toward an intention. He had simply walked to the edge of the room and sat beside her, the way a man sits in his own library, in the chair he has already decided is his. He rested one arm along the back of his chair. He crossed one leg over the other. He looked at the room with the same patient, unhurried attention he had brought to it all evening. The room looked back at him and did not know what to do with any of it. Clara had not moved. She held her hands in her lap and kept her expression as still as she had kept it in the gallery above the magistrate's courtroom 3 years ago, when the ruling came down and the people around her whispered and she had permitted herself nothing. Not a flinch, not a tear, not a single visible thing. She kept her eyes forward. She waited. He would speak. Men in his position always spoke first. Not out of courtesy exactly, but because the expectation had been theirs for so long that silence felt to them like an error requiring correction. The waltz continued. Some of the dancers resumed their movement, though with less attention to the music than before. "You are not dancing," the Duke said. His voice was low. It carried precisely as far as she was sitting and no further. She had the impression this was deliberate. "No," she said. A brief silence. "By preference," he said. "Or circumstance." She looked at him. The distinction was exact. Not a polite inquiry, but a precise separation of two different conditions. Choice and deprivation were not the same thing. The fact that he had separated them suggested he had thought about it before he spoke. "Both," she said. He accepted this without commentary. Lady Agnes, with the uncanny alertness of the very elderly at the precise moment social attention is most inconveniently directed elsewhere, opened her eyes. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Clara. She looked at the room. She closed her eyes again with the serene satisfaction of a woman who has lived long enough to be unsurprised by almost anything and is, in fact, rather pleased. The waltz neared its end. Lady Agnes required an escort for the evening, Clara said. She did not know, precisely, why she offered it. She did not explain herself as a rule. She did not explain herself to anyone, let alone to men of this rank in public rooms. "Yes," he said, as though the information were not new to him. She looked at him directly. "You knew that." "I was informed of Lady Whitmore's arrangements for the evening." Something moved in her chest. She catalogued it without permission and filed it for later examination. This was not the time. "You were informed that she would be bringing a paid companion." "Yes." She held this for a moment. He had known she would be here. He had known who she was. He had danced with every woman in the room and then walked to this particular wall and sat beside her with the calm of a man who has already decided where he is going to sit. "You are Miss Clara Voss," he said. Not a question. Daughter of the late Thomas Voss. Formerly of Voss House on the Hartley Road. Yes. He practiced law. He did. He died in February of 1840. Yes. Each answer was one word. She was not going to give him more than he reached for. Not until she understood what he was reaching for. He said, "I am sorry for your loss." She had heard this phrase since her father's death, perhaps 15 times. In every instance it had carried some degree of qualification, of distance, of discomfort, of the careful awareness that the condolences were being offered to the daughter of a convicted man. A small tax on sympathy that everyone paid without quite knowing they were paying it. The Duke said it the way you say a fact. Cleanly. Without the tax. She did not know what to do with that. "Thank you," she said. He turned back to the room. The waltz concluded. Applause moved through the assembly in its polite, automatic wave. Across the room, Clara could feel the weight of attention directed at this corner without looking to confirm it. She kept her gaze forward. His profile was easier to look at than the faces of Mrs. Drummond or Cecily. It asked nothing of her. "They are wondering what this means," he said. "Yes. Are you?" She considered how to answer honestly without surrendering ground she had not decided to surrender. "I am wondering," she said, "why a man in your position would choose this particular chair, at this particular event, with this much of the county watching." He was quiet for a moment. "Because it was the chair I chose," he said. She looked at him steadily. "That is an explanation that explains nothing." The corner of his mouth moved. The smallest possible movement. Not a smile, the precedent of one. The shape of it, controlled into stillness before it could become anything real. It was the first departure from his expression that she had seen all evening. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it does not." Mrs. Drummond found Lady Hurst at the East refreshment table at 10:30. The conversation that followed was conducted in the precise undertone of women who are certain they are being discreet and are not. "It cannot be what it appears," Lady Hurst said. Her champagne glass was still. She had not raised it in several minutes. "What it appears," said Mrs. Drummond, "is a duke sitting deliberately beside the disgraced daughter of a convicted embezzler in full view of 200 people. So I agree. It cannot be that." A silence. "He cannot know who she is," Lady Hurst said. "He used her name." Another silence. Then someone has misinformed him about her circumstances. Or, Mrs. Drummond said quietly, setting her own glass down, no one has informed him of anything, and he knows precisely who she is. They looked across the ballroom at the eastern wall. At the Duke, who was saying something in a low voice. At Clara, who was listening with her hands folded and her back perfectly straight and her face giving nothing away at all. Someone should speak to him, Lady Hurst said. Who? Mrs. Drummond said. Who in this room is going to approach the Duke of Carrowmere at his own assembly ball and advise him on the appropriateness of his seating arrangements? The silence this time was longer. She doesn't look like anything, Lady Hurst said finally. That is what I cannot account for. She is sitting there in that dress as though she belongs there. As though she has always been there. She has a particular quality of stillness, Mrs. Drummond said. The observation was made in a neutral tone. Neither of them knew what to do with it. They returned to watching. On the other side of the room, Cecily Drummond had not completed a sentence in 12 minutes. Her friend Miss Hartley had offered 3 conversational openings and received 3 non-responses. Cecily was watching the eastern wall with the expression of a woman working through a calculation that refuses to produce the expected answer. She was not jealous. She was absolutely clear on this point. Jealousy required a genuine rival, and the woman in the gray dress was not, could not be, a genuine rival. She was a companion, a paid attendant, the daughter of a man whose name was a cautionary story told in drawing rooms. The Duke had danced with Cecily. He had returned her to her family with the correct degree of attention. He had not, however, sat beside her. He had stood alone between dances, surveyed the room, and then crossed its full length to sit beside Clara Voss. Without asking. Without announcing. Simply sat. Cecily turned back to Miss Hartley and began a sentence about the flowers on the nearest table. Her eyes moved back to the eastern wall before she finished it. Clara was not a woman who surrendered information without purpose. She had learned this about herself in the year after her father died. Learned it the way you learn what a material is made of by pressing it until it shows you. She had been pressed considerably and discovered that what she was made of at the center of it was a particular quality of patience. Not endurance. Endurance was passive. This was patient and active at the same time. She could wait a very long time for a thing to become clear, and she could work while she was waiting. She applied this now. The Duke had known she was here. He had sat beside her deliberately. He had said her father's name and her father's profession. These were the pieces available to her. She arranged them and watched the shape they made and waited. He spoke again. Your father's practice, it was primarily conveyancing in his earlier years. Not a question. Information being deployed. And land disputes in the later ones, she said carefully. A pause. Survey records, he said. Registry documents. Boundary challenges. She looked at him. He was looking at the room, not at her. His voice was even uninflected, the tone of someone reading a list. You are very specific, she said. I have been reviewing certain documents, he said. From the county land registry. Records from the 1830s primarily. The music had changed, a country dance now, faster, filling the room with sound. Around them the noise was sufficient that their conversation, conducted at this level, went only to each other. Clara said, What kind of records? Boundary surveys. Parcel transfers. Amendment filings. She kept her hands still in her lap. And, Your father made annotations, he said, in the margins of 3 separate registry volumes. Methodical. Legally precise. A pause. He was building something. A chain of argument. She breathed. She breathed carefully and did not permit it to show and waited. I have not yet read everything, he said. What I have read raises significant questions about several land transfers in this county between 1832 and 1837. The county dance reached its loudest figure. Feet on the floor, hands clapped, the orchestra driving. Clara said, What kind of questions? He turned then and looked at her directly. His gray eyes were level and steady and asking her, without language, whether she wanted to hear what came next. She met his gaze and did not look away. Whether certain boundaries, he said, were amended fraudulently, after the fact. Whether several families in this county hold land that was never legally transferred to them. The music crashed on around them. Clara did not move. He found proof, she said. The beginning of it. And then, she said, and her voice was level, completely level, with the control of 3 years of practice. He was accused of embezzlement. And the inquiry never happened. And my father died. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. One word. It landed in her chest like a stone into still water. She looked away from him. She looked at the dancers, at the bright dresses and the moving arms and the complete ordinary cheerfulness of 100 people who had no idea what was being said in this corner of the room. 3 years. She had known something was wrong. She had known it before the ruling came down, and she had known it every day since, and she had had nothing. No document, no name, no thread to pull. Only the certainty, cold and useless, of a woman who understood her father and knew what he was and what he was not. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you have a right to know. I have had that right for 3 years. Yes. He said it without deflection. The documents were in an archive I reviewed only recently. I do not offer this as justification, only as fact. She returned her gaze to his. She looked at him the way she looked at problems, directly, without ornament, trying to find the shape of the thing. What do you intend to do? That is not yet decided, he said. She waited. Partly, he said. It depends on you. The orchestra announced a pause at 11:15. Servants moved through the room with trays. The dancers dispersed. The temperature rose slightly. 100 candles, 100 bodies, the accumulated heat of a social event approaching its 3rd hour. Lady Agnes opened her eyes and asked for more syllabub. Clara rose. The Duke rose also. He did not explain this. He simply stood when she stood and moved in the same direction. She glanced sideways at him once. He was looking at the room. They moved together through the assembly. Not formally, not with any declared arrangement, simply occupying the same path toward the refreshment table. The effect was immediate. The crowd did not part exactly, but it rearranged itself. Eyes tracked across the room and then quickly away. Conversations acquired a slightly self-conscious quality. Clara kept her chin level and her pace steady. She was aware of what she must look like. The gray dress. The incorrect social arithmetic of the situation. She was also aware, with a precision that was slightly unsettling, that she was walking through this crowd without the specific, familiar sensation of being beneath their notice. They were noticing her. Not because of who she was. Because of who was beside her. She did not permit herself to find this gratifying. The borrowed kind of visibility, the kind derived from proximity to power rather than from anything in herself, was the least reliable kind and the most dangerous. She had no interest in it. What she did find, quietly, was that she could breathe a fraction more easily. She reached the refreshment table, collected syllabub for Lady Agnes, accepted a glass of champagne she did not particularly want because declining it in front of the Duke and the assembled company seemed like an unnecessary declaration of something. She turned. Cecily Drummond was standing 2 feet away. Clara had not seen her approach. She was simply there, controlled, bright-faced, her dark eyes moving between Clara and the Duke with a calculation that was visible only at the very corners of her expression. Your Grace. She addressed him directly, with practiced warmth. The evening has been wonderful. Are you finding the assembly to your satisfaction? Instructive, the Duke said. I'm so glad. A beat. My father has been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you. He has a matter of business, regarding the eastern parcels, I believe. Her gaze moved to Clara, briefly and visibly. I imagine Miss Voss can spare you for a few moments. The word spare. Clara understood the construction immediately. It reversed the arrangement. Made it appear she was the one who had sought his company, who depended on it, who would be left behind while the real people had real conversations. It was elegant as these things went. She watched the Duke. He looked at Cecily Drummond with his gray eyes that communicated nothing. "Your father may correspond with my solicitor," he said, "regarding any matter touching the eastern parcels." A pause in which the implication of the sentence, "Your father's business is not my priority this evening," settled into the air without requiring statement. As for Miss Voss, he looked at Clara briefly, then back at Cecily. "She manages considerably more than most people in this room have recognized." Cecily's brightness did not shatter. It was too well constructed for that. But it contracted visibly by a precise and revealing degree. She produced a composed smile. She curtsied. She moved away. Clara stood with her champagne glass and said nothing for a moment. "You did not need to do that," she said finally. "No. It will complicate things." "For whom?" he said. It was not a deflection. It was a genuine question, and she knew it because she had been watching him speak for 2 hours, and she was beginning to understand when he was being precise and when he was being evasive. He was almost never evasive. He was almost always precise. For whom would this be complicated? For Clara, already in the most complicated position available to her in this county. For Cecily Drummond. For the Drummond family, whose patriarch held 40 acres that may not have been legally his for the past 8 years. "Point taken," she said quietly. Something moved across his face. Not approval, something quieter. Something that looked briefly, unexpectedly like recognition. She returned to Lady Agnes. The Duke returned to the chair beside her. Clara watched the room as he settled. Watched what the room did with the confirmation that this was not a single inexplicable moment but a sustained, deliberate choice. Mrs. Drummond was in urgent conversation with her husband. Mr. Drummond, broad-shouldered, red-faced, one of the 3 wealthiest men in the county, was listening with the expression of a man receiving information that requires recalibration of several existing assumptions. His gaze moved twice toward Clara's corner and twice moved deliberately away. Good, she thought. It was not her usual thought. In 3 years she had stripped herself very carefully of anything resembling confrontational satisfaction. It served no purpose, it cost energy, and it gave people evidence of feeling that could be used against you. But something had shifted in the air of this evening, and she could feel it in the way she held her shoulders. She sat down. "There is a solicitor in York," the Duke said, resuming without preamble as though the interval had not occurred. "Your father's original partner, Mr. Hargreave. I know who Hargreave is. He is still practicing. I have written to him." She looked at him sharply. "You have already written to him. Last week." She processed this. Last week. Before this evening. He had not been improvising tonight. He had been executing a plan already in motion. "What did you write?" "That I had reviewed certain documents. That his former partner had made significant annotations to the registry volumes in question. That I intended to bring this to the attention of someone in a position to pursue it." He looked at her. "I wrote that I would be speaking with you at this assembly." He had arranged this evening. He had known she would be here as Lady Agnes's companion. He had discharged his social obligation, danced with every eligible woman in the room, satisfied the county's expectation, and then come and sat beside her. Because this was what the evening had been organized toward. It had been deliberate from the beginning. "You could have written to me directly," she said. "Yes. It would have been more efficient." "Considerably," he agreed. She looked at the room. At the Drummond family, still in urgent conference. At Lady Philippa Hurst, whose attention had moved carefully away from this corner but whose awareness of it had clearly not. At Cecily, composed now, speaking with Miss Hartley, but not entirely present in the conversation. "You wanted this to be witnessed," she said. He said nothing. Which was his confirmation. She understood it. Whatever came next, the documents, the inquiry, the legal argument, it would come with the public knowledge that the Duke of Carrowmere had chosen this particular woman's company on this particular evening, in front of the assembled county. No one who had been in this room tonight could tell the story afterward without including that detail. And that detail would reframe everything that followed. He had given her something public. 'Before any legal proceeding. Before anything was proven. The public thing was not nothing. The public thing in this county was perhaps the most valuable thing available. It is a significant gesture, she said carefully, for someone who does not know me. He was quiet for a moment. I know your father's work, he said. I know what it cost him. He was a man who did a right thing in a county that preferred him not to. A pause. That is sufficient. She looked at her hands. 3 years. Her father's name dragged through every conversation in this county for 3 years. Her own life contracted to a grey dress and 4 shillings and paid suppers at events where Cecily Drummond could step into her path and remind her of her circumstances. 3 years of stillness while the people responsible drank champagne at county assemblies. She had never expected anyone to say it like that. That is sufficient. As though it were self-evident. As though it required no qualification. She pressed her lips together briefly. You should know, she said, that the Drummond family will resist. Yes. The magistrate who ruled on my father's case is connected to Lord Hurst through his wife's family. The connection is not publicly known. I found it in my father's papers. He looked at her. You found it yourself. 3 years ago. I had no way to use it. Something shifted in his expression. A small, quiet adjustment, as though a calculation had been revised. You have been working through this yourself, he said. Not a question. As far as I could, she said. Which was not very far. A woman in my position has no standing to make formal inquiries. No access to registry archives. No, she stopped. She had not said this aloud before, not to anyone. No credibility. If I had brought what I found to anyone in this county, it would have been received as the grievance of a disgraced man's desperate daughter. They would have been kind about it. And then they would have done nothing. He was quiet for a moment. What did you find? He said. She looked at him steadily. Tell me what you found first. A pause. The corner of his mouth moved again. That same almost smile, the outline of it, controlled before it arrived. The boundary survey of 1834, he said. The original. Your father's annotations identify 3 specific measurement discrepancies. The amendments made to the registry record in 1836 are not consistent with the original survey. They are consistent with each other. Meaning someone amended them after the fact to make them consistent. Yes. She breathed. The same person who filed the embezzlement charge. He looked at her. Why do you say that? Because the timing is exact, she said. My father began his annotations in September of 1839. The embezzlement charge was brought in January of 1840. He was silenced before he could complete his argument. She paused. Now you tell me what I found. He held her gaze. The financial record used to convict your father. The document alleging misappropriation of client funds. It was fabricated, she said. The handwriting on the alterations, he said, matches the handwriting on the boundary amendment. She held that for a moment. She had suspected this. She had spent 3 years suspecting it, turning it over, unable to confirm it because the original documents were held in the registry archive and she had no access and no standing to request access. He had access. He had confirmed it. My father's papers, she said. He kept copies of the original surveys. Not the amended versions. The originals, from before the alterations. I have them in the cottage. The Duke was very still. You have the originals, he said. My father made copies before he filed anything. He was meticulous. She looked at him. He knew something would happen. He prepared for it. He just did not prepare enough. The room moved around them. The orchestra had resumed. Bodies shifted. Voices rose and fell. With those copies, the Duke said, and the registry documents and Hogreave, the case changes substantially, Clara said. Yes, he said. They looked at each other. 2 people in a ballroom at the edge of the room, while the county danced and whispered and wondered. We will need to move carefully, she said. He said, we. She paused. She recognized what she had done. She had used the pronoun without deciding to. I will need to move carefully, she corrected. No, he said simply. We was correct. It was 1:45 when it happened. Clara had been half expecting it. She had watched Mr. Drummond across the room for 40 minutes, watched him move from his wife to Lord Hurst and back, watched the conversation grow more concentrated, watched the glances toward the eastern wall become less disguised. He was a man accustomed to problems he could resolve through money or connection. The thing in this corner of his own ballroom was a problem of a different kind, but she suspected he had not yet understood that. He crossed the floor toward them. He was heavy-built and well-dressed, with the particular manner of a county magnate who had never been seriously contradicted. A man who owned enough land that the word no had become unusual in his experience. He addressed the Duke without acknowledging Clara. "Your Grace." His voice was hearty, social, the voice of a man managing his approach. "I trust the evening is meeting expectations. Wonderful turnout. A beat." He looked briefly at Clara, at the grey dress, at the hands folded in her lap, and then back at the Duke. "I wonder if I might borrow you for a few moments. There is a matter I have been meaning to raise." Clara did not move. She kept her face still and her hands folded, and she watched the Duke. He looked at Mr. Drummond with precisely the quality of attention he had applied to everything all evening. Measured, unhurried, revealing nothing. "Mr. Drummond," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. You know Miss Voss." It was not a question. The pivot was clean and immediate, and Mr. Drummond had not expected it. His social hardiness adjusted, with a slight visible effort. Yes, by name. Her late father was a local solicitor. Tragic business. A practiced pause. "I'm sure Miss Voss has found her footing. Now the matter I wished to raise. I have been reviewing the county land registry," the Duke said. Mr. Drummond stopped. Absolute stillness, for 1 second too. Then, "I beg your pardon?" "The 1830s survey records," the Duke said. "The eastern boundary amendments of 1836 specifically." He looked at Mr. Drummond without urgency, without aggression, with simply the steady regard of a man who has all evening and no reason to hurry. "I expect my solicitor will be in correspondence with yours in due course." Mr. Drummond's color had changed. Not dramatically. He was too experienced a man for dramatic color changes in public rooms. But the heartiness had left his face, and what remained beneath it was older, and harder, and considerably less comfortable. "I'm not certain I understand what you're suggesting," he said. "I have not suggested anything," the Duke said. "I have described an ongoing review, which is, as yet, only a review." The implication was perfectly placed. Only a review. For now. Mr. Drummond looked at Clara, directly this time, with the look of a man who has identified the source of a problem and is considering whether the problem can be relocated. She held his gaze without expression. She did not help him. He looked back at the Duke. "Your Grace," he said more quietly, "I am certain that if there is any confusion about the registry records, it can be resolved simply and without formal proceedings." "I expect it can," the Duke said. "Good evening, Mr. Drummond." Mr. Drummond stood for a moment more. A man calculating, Clara thought, whether he had any move available that would not make things worse. He found none. He withdrew. Clara watched him cross the floor toward his wife. Watched Mrs. Drummond's face as he reached her. Watched the rapid, controlled exchange between them. Watched the careful repositioning of their social expressions as they became aware they were being observed. She looked at the Duke. "He understood you," she said. "Yes. He will move quickly. If there are documents he controls, he will act to obscure them before any formal proceeding begins." "He will try," the Duke said. "The original registry volumes are already in my possession. I had them transferred to Aldwick Hall 6 weeks ago under authority of county review." She looked at him. 6 weeks ago?" "Yes. You have been planning this since before the assembly." "Since before I returned to Yorkshire," he said. She held that. He had come back to this county, ended 5 years of absence, returned to an estate he had managed at a distance, at least partly for this. For the documents. For this evening. For what came next. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been all evening. Level, unhurried, giving away only what he had decided to give. "Because your father's work was correct," he said. "Because the conclusion of the case against him was incorrect. And because—" He stopped briefly. "Because a county that will ruin an honest man to protect a fraudulent land claim is a county that requires correction." She looked at her hands, at the familiar gray of her skirt, at the pale ivory trim she had repaired with mismatched thread. She had spent 3 years believing that the world was not going to correct itself. She had arranged her life accordingly. Small, careful, contained. The cottage. The 4 shillings. The grey dress. She had removed, piece by piece, everything that could be taken from her, so that there was nothing left to lose. And now here was this man, in this room, telling her in the level voice of a man who does not make promises he does not intend to keep that it was going to be corrected. She did not know what to do with hope. She had not had it in 3 years and she did not trust it, and she was also, in this moment, beginning to believe him. She pressed her lips together. "Hargreave," she said, "will expect your letter within the fortnight. I will write to him." A pause. "And the copies of the original surveys, I will bring them to you." "Yes," he said, simply, as though this had been settled some time ago. She looked up at him. "This does not mean I trust you." "It should not," he said. "Not yet. I mean it." "I know," he said. "It is sensible." She held his gaze for a moment. 2 people in a ballroom at the edge of a room. The full weight of everything present between them without either of them naming it. She was not going to name it. She was not going to permit herself any clarity about what was happening here beyond the legal fact of it. Not tonight, not in this room, not until she understood what the ground under her feet actually consisted of. "Thank you," she said. The words were plain and she meant them plainly. He inclined his head. At midnight the assembly began to move toward its conclusion. Carriages were called. Wraps appeared. The orchestra played a final country dance with the particular energy of musicians who are almost finished. Candles in the outer rooms went dark one by one. Lady Agnes woke fully and announced herself entirely refreshed. She asked what had occurred. "Very little of consequence," Clara said. Lady Agnes looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been in possession of all her faculties throughout and found this assessment incomplete, but said nothing. She began the process of departure, locating her second glove, debating the arrangement of her wrap, sending a footman to confirm the carriage entrance. The Duke remained. He spoke briefly with an elderly colonel who appeared at his elbow, then returned to stand beside Clara, standing now rather than sitting, which changed the angle of things in a way that was visible to the room. Mrs. Drummond had noticed. She was watching with a quality of attention that had moved beyond social calculation into something more concentrated. "Hargreave will want the copies of the original surveys before he can advise on the strength of the case," the Duke said quietly. "I understand that. If you can bring them to—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I will have my steward call at your cottage. Within the week, if that is suitable." She recognized the revision. He had been about to ask her to come to Aldwick Hall, and had stopped himself and offered a less socially fraught arrangement. She noticed that he had stopped himself. "That is suitable," she said. Lady Agnes was nearly ready. From the direction of the remaining Drummond party, still present near the far wall, the last of their family still in the room, a woman's voice, aimed with precision, carried just enough to cross the distance. One wonders what she offered him. It was said quietly, pleasantly almost. The particular viciousness of someone who understands that the damage is done by implication and not by volume. Clara did not stop moving. She kept her hand at Lady Agnes's elbow, her chin level, her pace entirely unchanged. She did not respond. She did not turn. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. She was going to walk through this entrance hall and down these steps and into the night, and none of it was going to be visible on her face. Behind her, a silence. Then the Duke's voice, quiet, carrying only as far as necessary. "Enough. One word. Not loud. Not heated. Simply final. The voice of a man in whose house they were standing. who had decided that this particular sound would not continue. Clara heard it land. She did not look back. She walked Lady Agnes through the entrance hall, accepted her wrap from a waiting footman, and guided the old woman toward the front steps while the carriage was brought around. The night outside was dark and cool. A half moon. The Yorkshire fields running away from Aldwick Hall in all directions. Quiet under the sky. She stood on the front steps and breathed. The door behind her opened. She turned. The Duke stood in the entrance, not following her. He was standing in his own doorway, watching the night with the same quality of attention he had brought to his own ballroom 3 hours ago. Behind him, the hall lights spilled gold onto the stone steps. "The carriage will be cold," he said. "It is 40 minutes to Lady Agnes's house at this hour." "I have made that journey before." "Yes," he said. "I expect you have made many cold journeys." She looked at him in the light from the hall. Everything that had passed between them this evening was still present in the air. Unresolved, unfinished, suspended in the way of things that have begun but not yet arrived anywhere. "Your Grace," she said. He waited. "You said sitting beside me was one reason." She held his gaze. "You said it precisely that way. One reason." He was quiet. "What is the other reason?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was entirely controlled. Gray eyes still, jaw set, expression holding exactly what it had held all evening. The careful discipline of a man who has decided what he will show and what he will not. "Ask me that," he said, "when the inquiry is settled." She held the answer. It was not evasion. She had been listening to him all evening and she knew the difference between a deflection and a decision. This was a decision, the deliberate ordering of things, the refusal to conflate what was personal with what was obligatory, the behavior of a man who does not want his actions misread. "Very well," she said. Lady Agnes's carriage arrived. Clara descended the steps. She did not look back, though she knew he remained in the doorway until the carriage moved. She sat inside beside the sleeping Lady Agnes and looked out the window at the dark fields, at the stone walls running between parcels of land, at the boundaries of this county, its borders and its claims and its long history of deciding what belonged to whom and under what authority. She thought about her father's copies, the surveys, the careful annotations in neat, familiar handwriting that she had read 100 times in the cottage by lamplight. She thought about Mr. Drummond's face when the Duke had named the boundary amendments. She thought about "we," said without inflection, as though it were the only reasonable pronoun. She thought about the word "enough," deployed in a dark entrance hall, and the silence that had followed it. She was not going to be reckless. She was going to write to Hargreave. She was going to retrieve her father's copies from the trunk under the cottage bed where they had lived for 3 years. She was going to read everything the Duke's steward brought her. She was going to think before she felt anything. This was the correct approach. She was committed to the correct approach. The carriage moved through the county in the dark. At 2 in the morning, the Duke of Carrowmere sat alone in his library. The room was lit by a single lamp. On the table before him, 7 documents. Originals. Taken from the county registry under authority of a formal review he had initiated in February, 9 months after his return to Yorkshire. Long enough after his arrival that no one had connected the review to his return. He had planned this carefully. He opened the boundary survey. 1834. The original signatures of the surveyors. The county recorder's stamp. And in the margin, in the precise, slightly angular handwriting that he had read many times over the past 2 months, a series of notations, measurements, discrepancies, a question about the filing date of the amendments. Thomas Voss had been doing in this margin what good solicitors do, showing his work, building a record, preparing with the particular care of a man who knew he was on contested ground, the foundation of an argument. He had been silenced before he could finish it. The financial record that had convicted him, the document alleging misappropriation of client funds, amount specific, date specific, appearing entirely credible to anyone who did not look closely at the handwriting, sat beside the survey. The Duke had spent an afternoon with a retired county recorder going through both documents inch by inch. The recorder, who had been in practice for 40 years and had seen fraudulent filings before, had identified the similarities in 20 minutes. Same pen pressure. Same deviation in the formation of the letter R. Same slight compression at the end of long lines that indicated someone working quickly, trying to finish before being observed. Thomas Voss had not embezzled from anyone. He had been framed by a man with access to the county records, knowledge of legal process, and a significant motive to see him silenced. The inquiry had never happened because the tool used to destroy the inquiry was the law itself, which was, when you thought about it, either the most cynical thing imaginable or the most logical, depending on your perspective. The Duke set the documents down. He thought about Clara Voss in the cottage, with copies of the original surveys in a trunk under her bed. 3 years. She had found the connection between the embezzlement charge and the boundary amendments herself. She had found it without access to the registry, without standing to make formal inquiries, without any tool available to her except her own intelligence and her father's papers and the particular patient certainty of someone who knows the truth and intends to hold onto it until the world is ready to receive it. He thought about the way she had said, "Tell me what you found first." Not pleading, not grateful, and negotiation. She had been doing this for 3 years alone, and she was not going to surrender information without understanding what was being offered in return. She had assessed him the way she assessed everything. Directly, carefully, without performance. Her father's annotations were methodical, precise, legally sound. He understood now exactly where they had come from. He had attended the assembly tonight for 3 reasons. The first was to discharge the social expectation, to appear, to dance, to be seen, to give the county's families the evening they had anticipated. He owed the county that, at minimum. The second was the survey documents. Everything he had built over 8 months required her cooperation to proceed. Her letter to Hargreave. Her copies of the originals. Her credibility as the person who had been wronged. He needed to tell her in person, in a way that left no room for misrepresentation later, what he had found. He had chosen to tell her publicly because public knowledge in this county was protection. If everyone in that room had watched him sit beside her for 2 hours, then the inquiry that followed would not be easily dismissed as the grievance of a disgraced woman. It would be the inquiry that the Duke of Carrowmere had publicly associated himself with. That changed the calculus considerably. The third reason he had gone to the eastern wall and sat in that particular chair. He sat with it for a moment. He was a man who had spent his life being very precise about separating what was obligatory from what was personal, what was strategic from what was genuine. It was not always a comfortable discipline. It frequently required him to set aside things he wanted until the correct moment, until the situation was clear enough that the personal could be expressed without appearing to be, or actually being, something he was using to serve another purpose. He had watched her for an hour before he crossed the room. Had watched the way she sat against the wall, not because she was defeated, but because she had decided it was the best available position. Had watched her hold herself through Cecily Drummond's small, precise cruelty without flinching, without hurrying, without giving anything away. Had watched the quality of her attention as she surveyed the room. Not the social scanning of someone looking for advantage or acknowledgement, but the genuine, patient observation of someone who finds the world interesting and is not too anxious to look at it clearly. He had wanted to sit beside her. He had wanted to before he understood who she was, before the connection to the documents, before the inquiry or the strategy or any of the rest of it. He had watched her for an hour and wanted simply to be in that corner of the room with her. He had also needed to be there for every other reason. The two things had been the same. That had made it easier. It had also made it, in a way he was still working through, considerably more complicated. He picked up the boundary survey and read her father's handwriting one final time. He returned the documents to their folder, tied the ribbon, placed it in the drawer, locked the drawer. Outside, Yorkshire in the dark. Silent fields. The stone walls between parcels of contested land. In the morning, his steward would be dispatched. He put out the lamp. In a cottage 40 minutes away, Clara Voss sat at her small table with a blank page before her. She had been sitting for 20 minutes. She was writing to Hargreave. She had his name at the top and the date and the opening line, and then she had stopped because she was, if she was honest with herself, afraid. Not of the Duke. Not of the Drummonds. Not of courts or proceedings or the long, uncertain machinery of the law. She was afraid of hope. Hope was the most dangerous condition available to her. She had felt it before. 3 years ago, when her father came home with that careful light in his eyes that meant he had found something real. She had felt it building in her chest like water rising, and then the accusation had come and the water had all gone at once, and what replaced it was colder and more durable and, in the end, more honest. She had built herself on something other than hope. She had been careful about it. And now a man had walked into her evening and sat down beside her and spoken about her father's work in the voice of someone who had actually read it, and had said that is sufficient as though it were obvious, and the water was rising again, and she did not entirely trust it. She put the pen to the page. Dear Mr. Hargreave, I write at the suggestion of the Duke of Carrowmere, regarding certain registry documents pertaining to my late father's practice. I understand you have already been contacted. I am prepared to proceed. I am also in possession of original survey documents which I believe will be material to any formal inquiry. I will arrange for their delivery within the fortnight. She paused. She read it back. She thought about her father showing her the eastern boundary of the parcel, in late summer when the heather was out, saying, "This has been ours since 1791. She had been 12. She had not thought about it again until 3 years ago. She thought about a man in a grey-lit doorway saying, "Ask me that when the inquiry is settled." She thought about the word "we." She had spent 3 years making herself into a person who did not need anything from this county. Not its approval, not its memory, not its charity, not its revision of the story it had told about her father. She had been very thorough about it. She had done good work. But she was also Thomas Voss's daughter. And Thomas Voss had believed, with a conviction that had ultimately cost him everything, that the truth was worth pursuing even when the pursuing was dangerous. That a right thing done at personal cost was still a right thing. That the law, imperfect and corruptible as it was, remained the best available instrument for correcting the record. She had disagreed with him about this for 3 years. She picked up the pen. She finished the letter, folded it, wrote the address. She set it on the table beside the lamp. The lamp was burning low, the wick almost done, the oil nearly spent. The light it cast was small and warm and would not last much longer. She looked at the letter in the lamplight, at her father's address in York, at the familiar shape of her own handwriting, slightly angular, precise, inherited from a man who had made his annotations in the margins of registry volumes with a care that had outlasted him by 3 years and had now, finally, been found. The lamp went out. The cottage was dark. Outside, the county. Its fields and its borders and its old contested acres and its long, imperfect memory. The stone walls between parcels of land running away in all directions under a half-lit sky. She sat in the dark for a moment. Then she went to bed.